So when I was young, I was just like everybody else. I needed a path forward. I didn't know what I was going to do, how I was going to do it, or the way I was going to do it, or what I was going to do. I needed some inspiration. Remarkably, the inspiration that I got was from reading a book called Beat the Dealer by Ed Thorpe. The story of Ed Thorpe is fascinating. He found a way to win at blackjack at a time when it was considered impossible that there was a way to possibly win, and yet he did it. And I thought, isn't that inspirational? Wouldn't it be great if I could do something like that at some point during my life? Never thought it would happen, but remarkably it did. I was a pioneer of sports trading long before it was even considered possible and before anybody had discovered it. And then I took that and ran it and took it onto a much, much higher level. The following video is my story of how that happened. So I first signed up to Betfair on the 18th of June 2000, very shortly after they opened for business. And I was one of the first batch of customers to ever sign up. Now they've got millions of customers all over the world and so on and so forth. But yeah, I was there right at the very beginning. That was my little bit of luck. Although in life, luck is where opportunity meets ability. And so I was interested in exchanges long before they launched, because I thought it was a fascinating and interesting concept, and I'd heard about it and bothered to research it. And basically the reason for me signing up to Betfair was to actually have a poke around, have a look and see what this new technology would do. So when I first started on Betfair, it was completely virgin territory. There was very little knowledge about the markets, and it was all fairly rudimentary, and there wasn't much money in the markets and so on and so forth. But what Betfair allowed me to do that was completely different was I could bet on something to win, or I could bet on something to lose. And trading didn't exist at that point. Nobody had really thought about it, and nobody had really done anything that clever. And my instinct was, well, what do bookmakers do? Because if bookmakers do a certain thing, and they're predominantly laying, maybe I can do that on the exchange. But that wasn't really possible because the markets just weren't mature enough to do anything of any particular use. So the very first thing that I did on Betfair was arbitrage. That was the very first thing that I did. So I would scout around, I would look for bookmakers that had quite large prices on certain events, and then I would just go and lay it off on Betfair. So I think golf was probably the first market I ever did this on, perhaps. And I would go off and find the best odds on Tiger Woods, back it with the bookmaker, and then stick the lay bet onto Betfair. And when the two of them matched, I would actually get a little bit of the profit in between the two. And that's where I started. The very first thing that I ever did, my instincts on Betfair, was to start doing arbitrage, because it was the first time I'd ever had the opportunity to lay a bet into the market. So all I needed to do was to go out there, find somebody with a big price at which I could back at, and then I would go in on Betfair and lay it at a lower price and net the profit between the two. And that is where I started. So yeah, my early days on Betfair, i.e. the first few months or so, was involved with doing arbitrage, and that's where I spent all of my time. I didn't bother doing anything more interesting. I dabbled with a bit of laying, I dabbled with messing around with other components and so on, but it was all dabbling at that point. All the money was coming in from arbitraging. And the great thing about it was that the bookmakers back then had no idea what you were doing. So they would quite happily take all of your money and do many different things. And they would have no concept of it, because obviously what was happening on Betfair was completely opaque. There was no possibility of them being able to understand what was going on there. So, you could arb yourself to death, basically, and that's what I did. But one morning I woke up and I suddenly had this brainwave, this moment of inspiration, where I suddenly thought, well, hold on a second here. I could actually do both of these on the exchange at the same time. I could back at a certain price and lay lower than that, and then if both of them get matched, I would do the same as arbing with a bookmaker that wasn't on the exchange. And I just thought, nah, that's totally ridiculous. How would that work? I don't understand how. So all I did was I went into the market and did that, and hey presto, it worked. And trading on betting exchanges was born. So when I realized that you could actually trade, you could In the stock market, you would buy low and sell high, or sell high and buy low if you're shorting. I figured out that there must be a whole multitude of interesting and exciting ways that you could participate in the market. So that was pretty much the point at which I felt that there was something in this, and that I could actually take the whole thing forward and evolve and move it on significantly. But the problem I had then was I was still in an ordinary job. And I got a right ticking off once, because I was actually in a meeting with the managing director of a firm, and actually just nipped onto the Betfair website and had a quick browse of a position that I had maturing in about an hour's time. and he saw me do it. And I got a bit of a bollocking, for want of a better word, after he saw that. And it was at that point that I realised that probably if I was going to do this seriously, I had to go and do it on my own and outside of a normal job. And for years, I'd been seeing opportunities come and go and had done nothing about it. And therefore, I think it was that point at which my mind was made up that I had to do something. And that was what I was going to do. I had no idea then if it was going to work or what the scale of it would be. But I just thought, you know what? I'm going to do this. It wasn't great timing. I had 3 children. I had twins that had just been born. But I felt that, the problem I'd had in the past is I'd seen opportunities come and go and I'd done nothing about it. And that really annoyed me. And I went to visit a friend of mine, and he said, you know what, Peter, you'll only regret the things you didn't do. He goes, it's fine. If you go out and do something and it doesn't work, it's fine. At least you know that didn't work. He goes, but you'll only regret the things that you never did. So I decided at that point that I was going to do it. So I finally made the leap, and everybody thought I was completely crazy. And when people said, what are you going to do, Peter? What are you going to do? I said, well, I've got a few ideas of what I want to do when I step outside of the corporate world. But they revolve mainly around this thing called Betfair. And they said, well, what's Betfair? I said, oh, it's a betting exchange. And they said, oh, so that's gambling then. And I said, well, it is, but I think that I've discovered something that maybe other people have not discovered, or if they have discovered it, they're not really talking about it. And that was the angle I was going to take. That was the path I was going to follow. And so really nobody gave me any credit for wanting to do that. And that level of pessimism was a bit of an issue for me. So in fact, the very first thing I did after I left my normal job was I actually started writing for Shares Magazine. I had a weekly column in Shares Magazine. That gave me a little bit of income if this Betfair trading thing did not work. And so that, combined with a couple of other things, just gave me a little bit of income, just in case there were any problems, and that in fact my idea was fundamentally flawed and I would have to follow some other angle or pursue some other type of career. But the fact is that soon after I started, I realised in fact it was the right thing to do, and that I didn't need to worry about that at all. And I was definitely on the right path. So the funny thing about making a jump like that is that what actually happened to me was I'd always been too focused on all of the things that could go wrong. And in fact, when I made the jump and started speaking to people and researching stuff and going into other areas, what actually turned out was that loads of things can go right by accident. So things can go wrong unexpectedly, things go right unexpectedly as well. And no sooner had I made the jump, then opportunities started popping up all over the place. And I suddenly realised that in fact this absolutely was the right thing to do. And to start off with, things were hard because you were slightly directionless. You had nobody to look to. I didn't back then. People would now, because people can come and speak to me and other people with experience. But I had no experience of what to expect or what I was doing. So it was a bit of a struggle to start with. And I wasn't sure for a little while whether it was the right thing in terms of the opportunity, in terms of scale. But as soon as I settled into that role and discovered more and more things, then it was just a case of, well, this does work, I need to put my foot down. And my instinct actually back then was that I had to do as much as I could as quickly as possible, because it felt to me that I'd discovered something that nobody else had and that the opportunity was going to vanish. With hindsight, that never happened. But that's why I worked so hard and so furiously so early on to achieve all the things that I wanted to, because I thought it was an opportunity that would be fleeting and would come and go. very, very quickly. Now, the fact is that didn't actually happen, but that was my motivation back then. So not long after getting going seriously, I realized that in fact I needed to do more things. I needed to expand my repertoire. And I figured out that in fact there were some rudimentary trading tools that were around in the market back then. They were incredibly expensive and pretty poor, to be honest. But I started using some of these tools, but I wanted so much more. It was no good for me using these tools that limited my capacity. There was a billion things I wanted to explore and to try. So I needed to create the software. That's how BetAngel was born. BetAngel came around because of a need to start introducing all of those things that the market needed, that I knew would be needed. The problem I had was that I had learnt to write rudimentary code many years ago, but I was totally out of touch with how people coded stuff nowadays. So I had to find somebody to help me, and I approached a whole load of people, including existing people that were on the marketplace, but none of them wanted to help. And it was only when I was doing a talk in London that I was approached by somebody who was at the talk that I got into dialogue with, and we agreed that we'd actually start to try and come up with some interesting tools. He was very proactive, very interested in the market. It turned out that in fact we'd been at loads of similar events in the past together, but we'd never actually talked. It was just one of those wonderful coincidences. And we had to figure out a way of getting the software to a stage that we'd feel comfortable with, that we could actually do something interesting with. There was no API around at this time. People like us were the founders of that particular market. It was only later that Betfair created an API to allow people to plug into their website. And also, the guy that I worked with, he was in a job at that time as well. So we came up with a small business plan that said, we'll charge for the software and hopefully that will give you enough money to be able to quit your existing job and do development full time. And that is exactly what happened. And that is how BetAngel was born. So after BetAngel was born and I was working with the developer, things started to expand rapidly from there. We came up with more ideas, we started gathering data, we started looking at the market in more depth. I came up with new strategies and concepts and stuff, and things really, really began to take off from there. Not only from a personal perspective, but if you look at the markets as well, liquidity was just absolutely skyrocketing at that point. And for me, I'd been in my sort of homes of interest. So I was trading the FTSE up and down market, golf, football, and all of those sort of things. Never, ever done anything on horse racing, knew nothing about horse racing, but I could just see enormous amounts of liquidity there occurring all of the time. So I thought, well, I've got to get involved in horse racing some way or another. And what I did was went into the market, started trading it randomly, and started to understand and pick out the characteristics of how the market traded. But up until that point, I had no interest or knowledge of racing at all. It was only the opportunity that got me involved within racing. And I just relentlessly pursued it until I had a strategy that worked. And it was an exciting time in the market because everything was new and volumes were shooting forward. My biggest fear at that point was I didn't know how many years I'd have to do it. So necessarily I slipped myself into this mode where I was taking every opportunity that I could in the market. Now, again, in hindsight, I didn't need to do that, but that was my instinct at that particular moment in time. And the explosion in terms of my knowledge went mental at that particular moment in time. I suddenly learned a lot more about racing, about markets, about how the markets function, about sport, different elements of modeling, and so on and so forth. And that process has continued basically until today, and that's why the BetAngel software continues to get updated, because as we find new opportunities, we introduce new tools to exploit those opportunities. So BetAngel for us is not a piece of software, it's a project, and it's an important part of everything that I do, but also it's a project that will continue to evolve for the foreseeable future. So once I'd settled into this pattern, I started to change some of the things that I do in my life around the sports cycle. So the sports cycle is basically stuff that occurs over the course of the year. Racing starts earlier or later at different times of the year. Football starts in August and runs through till May. Tennis moves from Asia across the globe to the US over the course of the year, and so on and so forth. But also my life started to change a little bit as well, because as I was pursuing opportunities, I realized that the best opportunities came around the most liquid events. And therefore I started trading on Saturdays. So very early on, I realized that Saturday was a big day for sport. I mean, it's pretty obvious in hindsight. But my instinct was still to do my normal Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 sort of work, when in fact a lot of opportunities were occurring outside of that time. So yeah, my pattern of behavior started to shift. And what I slipped into the mold of eventually doing was having spare time in the morning, turning up. So I would go out, exercise, do something completely different from trading, turn up around sort of midday to early afternoon, start looking at the markets, and then I would trade from about 2 until 9 o'clock at night. And I would tend to do that 6 days a week. I would tend to go from Monday to Saturday. Now, at different times of the year, Mondays and Tuesdays can be a lot quieter, so there's no need to do those days. But you tended to find that, you know, the money and the opportunity was in most of the liquid markets, which were the biggest events, the biggest races, the biggest football matches, the biggest tennis matches, and so on and so forth. So necessarily that started to alter my behavior. That was a little bit difficult, because especially with a young family, that's something you don't readily do. But the fact is, the opportunity was so great that it was definitely worth that sacrifice, because sacrificing that would give us the opportunity to do many other things, not only in the spare time that we did accrue, but also much later in the future. So yeah, I committed to the sports cycle. Once I'd got myself up to 100% speed, and I'd committed to the sports cycle and all of those things, then it was really just a question of scale. How far could I push it? How much money could I use? What could I do? How many events could I trade? What other opportunities were there for me? How could I do more of them? How could I do more of them at the same time? And so on and so forth. So once I realized that it was possible and that I could do it and that I understood all of the detail behind it, it was just a question of sticking my foot down and trying to do as much as I possibly could. And that's pretty much the mode that I've remained in ever since. I'm a little bit more relaxed now about not doing certain days. I don't need to do all of those days if I want to. But my desire and passion within me is for sports, and that's a key element of it, because if you enjoy something, you're always going to be doing a good job of it. So I enjoy the sports element of what I do, but I also enjoy trying to understand it, trying to find better ways of doing it, improving my strike rate, nudging up so I can earn a little bit more per trade, understanding why something went wrong, why something went right. And in fact, I think that passion will probably remain with me for the rest of my life, because it's getting answers to questions, discovering things that people haven't discovered before, doing clever and unusual things. A lot of the great stories that I've got to tell haven't been told yet. There'll be a time and a place for those stories. But I think that there are still plenty more stories and plenty more things to discover over the coming years. So as time has moved on, I've realized that in fact there is a life for me after trading. And with my children now coming of age, my eldest daughter was 3 when I started. And at the time of recording this video, she's just turned 18. So it's something that she can continue on with. She needs that opportunity, desire, passion, money, much more than I do. So my anticipation is that my children will inherit that knowledge and take it forward. They have to earn it themselves, and they have to make all those same mistakes and go through the same mix, but at least I'm there to be able to advise them. So I think naturally that is something that they will continue to do and continue to push forward on, and maybe one of them will come up with a new angle or discover something new. That's my hope and anticipation. I'm still going to be around. I'm not going to vanish anywhere soon. But for me, it's a problem of scale generally. Any excess money that I can't use to trade, I've invested, and as the investments get bigger and bigger, that's something that takes up more of my time. So I have to forego some of my activity in one thing to push it over into another. But you know, I'm an adventurous sort of chap. There's lots of things that I want to do and to discover, and there's still a couple of way out there goals that I'd love to achieve. So I will continue to pursue those for the foreseeable future. But yeah, I think my general passion for sports and trading and risk markets and, you know, finding new things is going to keep me going for a number of years, whether I'm directly or indirectly involved in it. My general advice is, and has always been, that this sort of thing, doesn't suit everybody. Some people have a perfect temperament for it, some people don't. When people send me bios, I can tell from most bios if people are likely to have the temperament from it. It's interesting. But all I'm looking for is to look at the bio and compare it to people that I know have been successful and the reasons that they were successful. And very often the reasons for success are not tied into your desire. They're tied into your temperament and your ability to see yourself through good and bad times, because everybody, has moments when they think they've lost it. So yeah, if you look at when you're starting, some people necessarily are going to be more likely to succeed than others, and that's just a fact of life. You can't specifically tell when you do this if you're going to enjoy it or do well at it or not. But what I would say, I would encourage people to give it a try. I'm not saying that you're going to be incredibly rich, have a Sunseeker yacht on a house in the Bahamas or wherever you would prefer to have one. But I necessarily think you should try, because there are lots of people that have come to this game on the back of something that I've said or something that somebody else has said or an idea that they've had, and where they ended up was nowhere near where they started. They actually branched off, found a sport that they preferred or liked, that they really understood, and they managed to do very well from it. So I'm not going to tell you that absolutely everybody makes it works and makes an enormous amount of money, and there are people that it doesn't work for. But what I would say, as long as you manage your risk, as long as you approach it in a sensible and conservative manner, there's no reason why you shouldn't give it a try. So thank you for watching the video. I hope that's been of interest to you. That was my journey and how I ended up being a full-time trader on Betfair and doing all of these other things, such as creating BetAngel and forging a path and being a pioneer for the modern sports trading markets. It's a very different world from traditional gambling, but it's one that I've thoroughly enjoyed and I hope that I can do for many years to come. And who knows where it will lead? Who knows where my next path is going to go? What I hope that I've done is given you some inspiration and knowledge of how all of this came around, and that you'll take something from that, and hopefully maybe you'll download a copy of BetAngel, find a nice little niche for yourself in the market, and change your life in the way that it changed mine. Anyhow, whatever you do, wish you the best of luck.